Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Fear, and I lead the young adult ministry here at Freedom Bible Church. That's ages 18 to 30. If this is your first time here, welcome. We're happy to have you. If this is your first time in church, period, maybe somebody dragged you here, they told you they were taking you to breakfast, we are happy to have you. And before I get started, I haven't spoken here in front of the whole church before, so I wanted to give you guys kind of a little my background, my journey here, so you kind of understood just who I am, where I'm coming from when I'm talking about these scriptures here today. I'll say I'm not from Port Charlotte. I'm not from Southwest Florida. In fact, I'm not even from anywhere close to here. I'm actually from Southeast Indiana, kind of in the Cincinnati tri-state area. And when my wife and I got married, we actually went up there to have like a little celebration. Actually, before we got married, because we had the wedding here, but all of my family, most of my family and friends were up in Indiana. So we had like a special little celebration up there. And my wife asked me, fashion's really not my thing, and I forgot my tie for this celebration. So my wife said, hey, why don't we let's just go to Walmart. That's no problem. We'll just go to Walmart and get a tie. And I said, this is a small town. We don't have a Walmart. Like, there ain't no Walmart to go to. She says, what do you mean? Where do you go? And I said, well, unless you want to drive 30 minutes, you're just out of luck. So I was thinking on the way here, it's like, you've ever heard, you might be a redneck if so-and-so? You might be from a small town if you don't have a Walmart. Whenever I hear people say Port Charlotte's a small town, I'm like, you have no idea what you're talking about. So anyway, the reason I came to Freedom Bible Church is actually, if you're not aware, if you've never been to the Charlotte Stone Crab Stadium, we have a billboard over there, the church does. And when I got down here, I actually came down here to help my grandparents find a house, get moved in. My grandfather's no longer with us, but we're still down here. And when we first got down here, since I'm a huge baseball fan, I went to check out that stadium. And on the way back, I saw a Freedom Bible Church billboard. I'll be honest with you, there wasn't anything special about the billboard. All it was just like the church's logo, I think. But the reason I saw it is because I thought, I've never really seen a church with a billboard before. It's kind of cool. So I Googled it real quick, I saved it, and we showed up. And we were going for a while. We actually would sit in the back left corner. That's just kind of my style, in the back of the room. And my grandpa would sit back there, and here's what he would do. If he was in a public place like this and he needed to tell you something, but he didn't want to draw attention, he'd give you one of these, like, hey, he'd give you a little nudge. And what he said, hey, you see that girl up there? Talking about Brittany that just sang that song, who is my wife now. He said, hey, see that girl up there? She's pretty. You should talk to her. So you're probably asking, did I talk to her? No, I chickened out. So then, actually another day, I was sitting in the back right corner here, and what are the odds? There's 500 seats here. She came and sat right in front of me. And you're probably asking, Michael, did you talk to her that day? No, didn't talk to her that day either. So I got this bright idea. Sometime, I maybe have been coming for a few months, and I figured out at some point, somehow, that she was the pastor's daughter. Either Frank said it or somebody had said something. Context clues, I figured it out. So I thought Frank announced that he was starting a Wednesday night Bible study, and he was going to be leading it. And I thought, all right, pastor's daughter, she sings, she's involved. 50-50 shot she's going to be there. So, don't laugh, because some of you in this room have done the exact same thing. I showed up to that Bible study hoping she would be there, and she was, and the rest is history. So anyway, I have the awesome honor to be the pastor's son-in-law. Somebody asked me the other day what it's like to be the pastor's son-in-law. And I could tell you just from, my experiences with Frank and Darla, they're both incredibly gracious. And, I told somebody this week, Frank is the same person off stage that he is up here every week. And you can know that for sure. But I'll say this, you know what they say about pastors' daughters? They're flat out the craziest. And that couldn't be true. My wife, if you gave her, this week, Pastor Frank, he'll tell you the exact same thing. If you gave her sugar, she eats a cupcake, she will literally be bouncing off every wall in this place. We're going to Boca Grande this week, and when she gets behind those golf carts, she's not a bad driver, she's just insane. It's not, It's not safe. So, but I say all of that because, we think when we give something to the church, we serve in some way, we serve in VBS. We don't always see what God's doing. Daniel, put this quote up here. God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, and you may be aware of 3 of them. That's by John Piper. He's a very popular pastor, I believe, in Minnesota. And I think that somebody here paid for that billboard 2011, 2012. We don't know who you are, and you may have thought you did not see any return, but you did, because, I can't, if I could pay you back, I would, but I don't know who it was, so we're out of luck. But my point is, you have no idea what God is doing. Just something from such a small thing, giving money, you did not see a result, but you did. And it not only completely changed my life, it completely changed future generations to come. So we have no idea what God's doing. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. It's amazing how God works, how he transforms our lives. So I'm going to be in Luke 22 today. It's Luke 22, 31 through 34. I'm going to read it here for you, and then I'm going to actually go back, and it's really about Peter, but I'm going to go back and kind of explain Peter's personality for you, and then we'll come back to these verses, all right? So let me read it. Luke 22, 31 through 34. It says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. And Peter said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. And Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. Jesus, by the way, Simon, Simon, I want to give you an idea. When I say Simon or Peter today, same guy, all right? Simon was kind of his old name. When Jesus met him, he gave him a name Cephas, which is, his new name in Aramaic. And then he also gave him the name Peter, which would be Greek. So depending on what language you would read. So when I say Simon or Peter, same guy today, not a different guy. It means rock. Out of all the disciples, he was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. Out of all of them, he was probably considered the leader. He was the outspoken one. His background, before he met Jesus, he was actually a zealot. Basically, it was a political group that wanted to overthrow Rome. So in Jesus' disciples, there is a guy that wanted to overthrow the government. He was in Jesus' inner circle. So there were miracles Jesus did that only a few of the disciples saw. Peter was one of those in Jesus' inner circle. And I don't know if you guys have ever been in a situation where maybe you played a sport or you're in your job and maybe the boss or somebody or the coach said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we need to do. Does everybody got it? And if you're like me, you're not saying a word even if you don't got it. Like you just, all right, I know what you're talking about even if you have no idea what they just said. Peter's not like that, all right? Peter is not afraid to speak out even to Jesus. Listen to this. Matthew 15, 13 through 16. He answered, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind guides. He's talking about the religious leaders. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. But Peter said to him, explain this parable to us. And Jesus said back, are you also still without understanding? Jesus says this parable, and Peter's like, can you explain that to us? We have no idea what you're talking about. Listen to this, Luke 12, 40 through 41. Jesus said, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for everybody? Who are you talking to? You talking to us or for everybody? Peter, he was the bold one of the group, but it got him in trouble. Listen to this, Matthew 16, 21 through 23. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord. This is never going to happen to you. Peter tells Jesus says, hey, I'm going to have to go to the cross and die, but I'm going to raise again. And Peter says, that's never going to happen to you. And here's what Jesus says. He turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. So we see who Peter is here. Peter, when he says, get behind me, Satan, he's saying like, hey, this is evil. What you're saying, this is the plan of Satan. You're going to prevent me. You're trying to prevent me from going to the cross, which is necessary for the rest of the history of the world. It's evil. It's Satan's plan. And Jesus is saying, we can't do that. So let's go back to verse 31. Verse 31 of Luke 22. So again, we're talking about Peter here. It says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But if you're like me, you read that verse and you think, like, where does that even come from? Like, why does he target Peter in this verse? Like, where does it come from? So we have to go back just a couple of verses. They're having the Last Supper. All the disciples are there. And here's what Jesus says. But behold, everybody, look and see. The hand of him who betrays me is at this table. The person that's going to betray me, the disciple, is sitting here with us. For the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. And the disciples began to question one another which one of them it was going to be that was going to do this. Can you imagine the paranoia? You've got all the disciples sitting there, and you've got your other 11 disciples who are not going to do it. Jesus says, somebody sitting here is going to betray me, and the paranoia starts. Who's going to do it? And they begin to question one another who was going to be this person. And here's what happens. Luke 22:24. A dispute also arose among them. These are the disciples that started the church as we know it. They were the first group that started the church as we know it. A dispute arose among them as to which of them was going to be regarded as the greatest. So Jesus says, one of you is going to deny me. They start arguing about it. And before you know it, it's turned into, hey, I'm not only going to betray him, I'm going to be the greatest out of them all. So, Jesus, what's interesting is Jesus targets Peter. He says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. So why does he target Peter out of everybody there? That tells me that Peter was right in the middle of it. His outspoken personality, he was probably right in the middle of that dispute and probably right in the middle of saying, I'm going to be the greatest. And I love what he says. He says, Simon, Simon, behold, don't miss this. Satan has asked me, so Satan has asked God that he can sift Peter like wheat. Sift like wheat basically means to shake him up, to shake his faith in the hopes of separating him from his faith. So he's going to try to shake his life, bring trials his way. Basically just, sift just means shaking his faith. Here's what it says. Here's what Jesus says in return, 32. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. And Peter said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and death. And Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny that you know me 3 times. The rooster's not going to crow until you say you deny me 3 times. I love how Jesus says your faith won't fail. And he was right. We're going to see Peter failed, but ultimately his faith didn't fail. It lasted. And so, but the question is, did it happen? Because if Jesus says this is going to happen, and it doesn't happen, we are wasting our time. We might as well all pick up everything we're doing and go to KFC for lunch, because we're wasting our time. But thank God it did happen. Luke 22:54 through 62. This explains what happened that day. They seized Jesus and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, This man was also with Jesus. But Peter denied it, saying, Woman, I do not know him. And a little later, someone else saw him and said, You are also one of them. But Peter said, Man, I'm not. And after this, after about an interval of an hour, still another insisted, saying, Certainly this man was also with him, for he too is a Galilean. But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you are talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned, looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. I think it's easy, growing up, you go to Sunday school, you go to church. I think it's easy for us to hear this story and see Peter as the bad guy. But I read this, man, I feel for him. Like, Peter, I titled this sermon, We're a Lot Like Peter. And Peter is us. And I think there's 3 big points out of all these verses that we can take away from Peter's denial. First one is, failures are painful, but they produce a more faithful, humble heart. That's what happened to Peter. I'm going to give you 5-10 seconds here. Think of the person in this world, and it shouldn't take you long. You can figure it out within 2 seconds. Think of the person in this world that you have the hardest time forgiving. Maybe you're bitter towards them. You cannot forgive them for something they did to you, and maybe something they did was, just horrible. Think of that person that you cannot forgive. Now, think of how hard it is for you to forgive them, and how much greater is it God continues to forgive us when we say, I'm never going to do that again. When everything we've ever done for him, he continues to forgive us. And that's what I've learned, is that whenever we have trouble forgiving someone else, whenever we start to be self-righteous and start to think about, look what so-and-so did, I'm not as bad as him, it's because we've forgotten how much God has forgiven us. And Peter realized that. That's what happened here. When I say failures are painful and they produce a more faithful, humble heart, this sin caused Peter to weep. And a lot of times our sin causes that same pain. But what it does is it makes us realize how much we need a Savior. And that's what happened to Peter. Peter realized he needed less of himself and more of Jesus. And I love this. Jesus, after he's already raised from the dead, he meets with the disciples. They have breakfast. And afterwards, he pulls Peter aside. Here's what he says. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And Peter said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. What's interesting, the Greek words for love here, there's 2. So when Jesus says to Peter, do you love me more than these? He's using a word, agape love, which means unconditional, sacrificial love. Peter responds with phileo love. I don't know if you guys heard Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. It means basically like brotherly friendship type love. So Jesus says, do you love me sacrificially? Do you love me unconditionally? And Peter replies back and says, I love you like a friend. 2 different types of love. And an example to use it is like, I love my wife, agape love, unconditional. I love the Cincinnati Bengals. Definitely not the same type of love with the Cincinnati Bengals, that's for sure. So 2 different types of love. That's what happens. So Jesus says it to him again. He says for a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter said back, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. So Jesus said, tend my sheep. And he said it for the 3rd time. Now here's what's interesting. The 3rd time Jesus says this, he changes the words he used. He uses the brotherly love word for love. He says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, do you love me? Peter understood. He changed his tone. Jesus changed it up on Peter to know what type of love he was talking about. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Peter, if you love me, take care of these guys. Take care of these guys, preach the word, love them, encourage them. If you love me, do that. Because Peter was going to be the leader of the group when he was gone. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you're old, you're going to stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Jesus is basically, he's telling Peter, hey, one of these days, it says, this he said to show by what kind of death he was going to glorify God. He's telling Peter, you're going to need this type of unconditional love towards me because someday you're going to die for me. Literally, physically, go to your death for me. Be a martyr. And afterwards, Jesus said, follow me, Peter. I love in these verses, that's a different Peter right there. It says he wept. Or he was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, do you love me? Peter loved Jesus, but after his last incident. He's probably still a little shamed from what happened with the denial. And, he knew his life didn't reflect a total commitment to God. He was humble. That's a different Peter than was arguing with the disciples. And I love Jesus wanted to stretch Peter. He wanted to show him how important that commitment was going to be. But here's what I love most of all about everything. Jesus is strengthening Peter. He's actually encouraging. He's not accusing him of anything. He's actually it's very gracious. And this is such the character of our God to be gracious, which leads me the second point. I love when Jesus tells Peter this, he basically says, strengthen your brothers. So this says one of the biggest things we can learn from these verses, the importance of strengthening our brothers and sisters. Verse 32 says, but I have prayed for you, Peter, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. When you have gotten through this sin, it has caused a lot of pain, and it causes us a lot of pain. But when you get through it, God says, strengthen your brothers. I think about us with that. A lot of us, we've been through a lot. Maybe we've caused the pain. Maybe somebody else has. Maybe life has just knocked us down. We all have a unique story and a unique way to strengthen our brothers. And it's so important when Jesus meets Peter after this all happens, that's what he says, strengthen your brothers. It has to be incredibly important. If not, he wouldn't have said it. And I asked this. Frank talked a lot last week about prayer and the power of prayer. And I just ask you this. Are you praying consistently for your brothers and sisters? Are you praying for our church? Are you praying for the church as a whole? Because I'll tell you what, I'm only going to say this because I do a terrible job of it. So I can say it because I do a horrible job of this. But are you praying? Are you praying for your church? Are you praying for your pastors? Are you praying for Pastor Frank and his family? Are you praying for Patrick and Sarah and their family? Are you praying for our elders, our leaders of our church, everybody that serves in some capacity? Are you praying for your family members that aren't here? Your family members that aren't saved? Your friends that aren't saved? I say because I do a pretty terrible job of that. And I think when we're talking about this strengthening, obviously Jesus prayed for Peter. I think another thing is just encouragement. I'll say this, when I first got here, that Bible study where I met my wife, the first person that came and introduced herself to me and my grandma were there was Linda Souza. And she gave us just a hug and welcomed us. And here's what I think is fascinating. That was like 5 or 6 years ago. And I can remember the first person, I didn't even know who she was then. I can remember the first person that came to welcome us, and that was 5 years ago. That tells us why Jesus is saying this, is that encouragement and strengthening our brothers is so important that somebody like me who can't really remember what I had for lunch yesterday can remember who the very first person was that welcomed me to the church. And that just says how important. I said earlier about how we have no idea, even the money we give, the time we give, we have no idea how God can use that. Just a simple hug, a simple hello, a simple text in the middle of the week saying, hey, how you doing? We have no idea how important that can be. And the last point I wanted to make on this aspect of strengthening our brothers and sisters is that Jesus said they're going to know you by the way you love each other. We should be the most gracious, forgiving people on the planet because we should understand how much we've been forgiven. I think when our brother falls, we need to lift them up because we have this example of Jesus lifting Peter up after he fell, and this is the guy that was in charge at the very beginning of the church as we know it. Jesus lifted him up. Last point, God relentlessly pursues us. Mark 16, 6-7. Jesus he's already raised from the dead in context of this verse. He's not in the tomb anymore. Mary and Mary Magdalene, they come to Jesus' tomb. And there they find the angel of the Lord sitting there. And here's what the angel says to them. It says, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, but he is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him? Go tell his disciples and Peter, underline Peter, his name is there. Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. We talk about being gracious. why mention Peter out of everybody in that verse? And I think it tells me God just pursues us when we don't deserve it. He knew Peter needed to hear from him. Peter needed it. And I think of the story of the prodigal son. If you've ever heard that story, I'll just give you a quick synopsis. There's a good son, and there's, I shouldn't even say that because they're both not great. I'll say there's this one son in different aspects. I have to explain it more. But there's one son that basically wastes all his father's inheritance. For example, the father gives him all his money. The son goes and wastes it all away. The son finally decides, hey, this life's terrible. I want to come back home to the Father. It's just a beautiful picture of sinners wanting to come back to God. And what it says is the father runs to meet his son as he's coming. The father doesn't say, hey, you've got to pay me back double for everything you've wasted. No, actually it says the father welcomes him in, throws a party, and it actually says he runs towards his son. That's the character of God, and that's why that's in there where it says Peter. I love this verse here, Romans 5:8. It says, but God shows his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. When Peter was boastful, when Peter said, Jesus, I'm never going to deny you. I'm going to go to the death for you. And he ends up denying him. God said, that's the guy I'm going to put in charge. You know, if you're here today and maybe you're not sold on this whole Jesus thing, to be honest, you just don't believe any of it. If you're here and you are hung over right now, if you're here and you're suffering with addiction, whether that's drugs, pornography, anything, or if you are self-righteous, Jesus is saying, that's who I want. That's God continually pursues us. If you're not perfect, great. Welcome, you're in the right place. Feel broken, dirty? The Bible's filled with people. Peter, the guy that was in charge at the beginning of the church as we know it, was just like that. You're in the right place. In closing, let me read this. This shows the transformation of Peter. He denied when his life was on the line earlier. Here's what happens later on. Saying, what shall we do? Peter, they get brought in front of the religious leaders. Here's what it says. What shall we do with these men? Talking about the disciples. For that a notable sign has been performed through them and is evident to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And we cannot deny it. But in order that it may be spread no further among the people, let us warn them to speak no more to anybody in this name. To speak to nobody anymore about Jesus. So they called them, charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered, whether it is right for the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot speak of what we have seen and heard. We can't help it. Whether it's right, we cannot speak about what we've seen Jesus do and what we've heard him say. I love this. I think, Peter's failures made him stronger and a better leader. What better guy to have preaching the gospel than somebody that really understood the grace and the mercy of God. And that's the character of our God. I just think, the love of God, the cross exposes us all, that we're all sinners, and that the cross is the best representation that the love of God continually pursues us. And I just love, let's read this, 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 11. It says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. That's what happened to Peter. When he was weak, he became strong because he relied on God more than he ever had in his entire life. If you're like me, you notice that when life is good, we tend to forget about God. When life is good, we forget to pray. But when life hits us hard, when our sin causes pain, then we are strong because we rely on God. Early James said, count it all joy, brothers, when you face trials of various times. Count it all joy because these moments make you think of me. When everything's going good, you tend to forget about me. And I want to end on this. Freedom, talk about Freedom Bible Church. Freedom doesn't equal perfection. We're not free because we're perfect. And I can say you can trust God because when I didn't want him, my freshman year I played summer baseball in a kind of a Christian team in New York, and man, it was spiritual warfare going on that summer. This is why I love doing the young adult, the 18 to 30-year-olds, because man, life, when you're in that age, you're either going this way or you're going that way. And God just continued to pursue me. And I think, when my sin in my life, even today, when it tries to destroy me, God saves me. Same thing happens for all of us. I think, you talk about freedom, you think about freedom doesn't equal perfection. We're not here at church, so if this is your first time here, you have no idea anything about Christianity, anything about God. Let me tell you this, we are not here because we're perfect. We are here because what Romans 5:8 said, because while God, he showed his love for us while we were still sinners. That's why we're here at church today, because while we were sinners, God still died for us. Most of all, we're celebrating a God that saved us. Freedom doesn't equal perfection. We're not free because we're perfect. We're free because of what Christ did on that cross. Pray with me.